Hello and welcome back to another update. As I cover the latest developments throughout the front line, we start out in the direction of the Kherson-Dnieper area, where the Ukrainian forces have managed to expand their zone of control across the eastern bank of the Oskil River line. We see that they managed to push westwards from their currently held positions and trying to expand their foothold. It doesn't seem like the Ukrainian It doesn't look like the Russian forces have managed to launch a successful counterattack yet, but there is some fighting ongoing in this direction. And as we see that the Ukrainian forces have managed to gain a foothold across the Dnieper River, the Russian forces fired the commanding officer in charge of the Dnieper area, which means that there were likely some issues with that commander, and therefore they're switching around. There's also the possibility of the Russian army just being angry that something actually managed to come through. Whichever the case, we see now that there's a switch in command, and we'll have to see if that has an effect on the front line here in this direction. We then move on to the Robotyne area, where we here see that the Ukrainian forces managed to advance west of Robotyne. With this, they are attempting to expand their zone of control west of Robotyne, as well as some fights in the eastern parts. This is to expand the foothold they currently hold in the depth of the Russian defenses. They have managed to advance somewhere around 8 kilometers deep into Russian territory. And according to a Times article there, they interviewed the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, Zaluzhny. He said that the Russian defenses here in this direction, in the Zaporizhia front, actually spanned a total of 15 to 20 kilometers of minefields. So this actually means that after 5 months of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, they didn't manage to even break through half of the minefields of the Russian forces. So with this, we see that they clearly do not have the capacity to launch a successful offensive against the Russian forces in terms of getting through the minefields that the Russian forces have built in preparation. He also mentions in the article that the Russian forces, whenever the Ukrainian forces advance through some of these minefields, they just expand the minefield backwards, as well as replace mines that were blown up in the front, if they have the ability to do so, depending on the Ukrainian advances. So we're seeing that the minefields is a huge hindrance for the Ukrainian army, which is something he mentions in the article, where he covers all of the different parts where he believes needs to be achieved by the Ukrainian army before they're able to actually advance or launch a successful offensive again. But we'll get back to this article later as we cover the different advances here in the Battle of Avdiivka in the direction of the city northwest of Donetsk. What we're seeing on this part of the front line is that the Russian forces have managed to advance in the north of Krasnohorivka, and there is heavy fighting all throughout the surrounding areas of the city. We're seeing that the Russian forces are attacking north of Krasnohorivka, northwest of Krasnohorivka, and southwest of Krasnohorivka in the direction of the coke plant. They're also attacking west of Kamyanka and south of Kamyanka, trying to establish proper positions to the east of the city. We're also seeing them attack in the southeast of Avdiivka, where here there's a Ukrainian outpost and military base. In the south of Avdiivka, where here there's heavy trench systems, southwest of Avdiivka with another Ukrainian military base and fortifications, to the northeast of Upytne to expand the zone of control and protect the village from the Ukrainian counterattacks we're seeing in the area, and to the north of Vodiane in the direction of Severne and to the west of that area. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces are counterattacking to the west of Vodiane from Pervomaiske, in the northeastern parts of Upytne, south of Avdiivka towards the Russian gained positions in the trench networks, and in the northern parts east of the coke plant is trying to regain control over the forest lines by the railways, and to the north in the direction of the recently gained territory by the Russian forces by Krasnohorivka. So what we're seeing here is that there's heavy fighting taking place because the current days is days of sunlight, where we're seeing that both drones, airplanes, and armored vehicles are able to launch their operations in this area. And I say armored vehicles because we're both seeing an influx of NATO weapons such as Leopards and Bradleys and M113 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, as well as an increase in the use of Russian armored vehicles by the Russian forces after the first few days where they lost a lot. Since then, they've mainly focused on infantry-based assaults. The current situation is that the Russian forces are focusing on advancing and increasing their zone of control by Krasnoyarivka. This is to establish a stronger northern flank so that they can start pushing towards Berdishi and Stepove, because now they've reached the forest lines here by the railways. So with this, we are looking that the Russian forces are likely to establish positions by the railways here to the north of Krasnoyarivka, trying to control the forest lines here, as well as in the western side before they launch attacks towards Stepove and Berdishi. This is to secure their flanks, and if they manage to capture the flanks and establish positions by the railways, they'll be able to launch assaults towards the northwest and the hills located here north of Stepovo and Berdishi, after which they'll start storming the villages, trying to gain control of them, and cutting the road between Novobakhmutivka and Berdishi. So this road is the one they want to cut to a certain control over these villages before moving further southwards. So the current situation is that they want to essentially gain a flank here by the forest line that goes through the northern parts of Krasnoyarivka and all the way to the north of Berdishi, cutting the roads between the north and the south. This will give them a strong enough flank to then start moving southwards or towards the coke plant from the northern fields, or even straight towards Orelivka, bypassing the village of Semenivka. So essentially it will allow for a lot of movement here in the north. As for the coke plant itself, we see here that the Ukrainian forces are trying to counterattack in this direction. This is likely to regain control over the forest patches and forest lines here by the railways, which will then allow them to move northwards and push them away from the railways. The railways here are covered with forest lines, and as such they are the perfect area to essentially create a front line. The Ukrainian forces want to create a front line by the railways, which will allow them to have proper positions, and with the heights here in the north of Stepova, they're able to overlook the fields to the east of the railways, and at the same time the coke plant allows them to have a proper position here to the north of Avdiivka. However, the biggest threat to the Ukrainian positions is the waste heap, which is the high grounds in this area, and the Russian forces currently control that. As for the eastern parts where the Russian forces are currently launching operations, this is to throw the Ukrainian forces back into the city and avoid them counterattacking here to the east. If the Russian forces are losing Kamyanka in a Ukrainian counterattack, that will threaten the whole Russian positions in the north, and they could essentially bypass from the south. This will allow the Ukrainian forces to attack the Russian positions by Krasnoyarivka and cut the Russian supply lines here to the east of Krasnoyarivka between Krasnoyarivka and Novosilka Druha. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces may be looking to launch operations here to the east of Avdiivka, and this is why we're seeing the Russian forces preemptively launching operations here, expanding the fields between the Russian and Ukrainian forces and preventing a Ukrainian counterattack from reaching success quickly due to an expand in the distance they need to cover with a potential counterattack in this direction. We then move to the southern parts of Avdiivka, where we see here that there's the military base and fortifications both to the east and to the south of Avdiivka, which the Russian forces are all attacking at the same time. This is to prevent the Ukrainian forces from sending reinforcements to all areas at the same time, and whichever area they are lacking with the reinforcements at, the Russian forces will most likely focus their attempts and try to take control over it. At the same time, we're seeing that the Russian forces are increasing their attacks and sending reinforcements to the area as they launch the attack with little concentration of forces. This is to gain the element of surprise, which is why they managed to advance more on the first days than they have since then, as they managed to launch this attack only using units that were already present at the front line before the attack. The Ukrainian forces responded very quickly by sending 2 additional mechanized brigades from the Zaporizhia front to the Avdiivka front, and now the Russian forces are sending their own reinforcements to try and stabilize the situation and send additional forces to the front to allow and strengthen the Russian attack to continue. So we're seeing that there's an increasing amount of units in this front line. Despite the lack of numbers in this front, it is already more intense than the Battle of Bakhmut. It is actually reported to be the most intense fighting since the start of the invasion. So this is what is currently going on in the Avdiivka direction. We then move on to the northern parts by Bakhmut in the northern flank, where the Russian forces managed to advance here south of Berhivka by the forest lines here by the Berhivka Reservoir, and with this we see that they have managed to advance slightly here to the south of the Vasilivka, allowing them to connect and gain full control over the forest lines here in the area.